Diane Smith-Gander, Chairman of Transfield Services and esteemed colleague of mine while I was on the board as a Director of Transfield Services, and importantly a very great leader of the women's leadership areas in this country. And I think today we're coming together really to talk about our joint involvement, if you like, in Transfield Services, the history of Transfield Holdings in the way it's backed services over the years, your own recollections of some of the things that we've done, and really just a conversation about all these really interesting journeys that have been passaged by us all through the Transfield Services common ground.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. So, Di, why don't you tell me a little bit about how you came to be involved with Transfield Services in the first place, and that might just help us, even with some of your background might be useful, just to place you in terms of your first connection with Transfield Services.
So I'm a good girl from Western Australia, but I moved to the east, came to Sydney, and I worked for a company called PA Consulting. And PA Consulting's very charismatic leader in New South Wales and then later Australia was a guy called John Colvin. And many years march forward, I always kept in touch with John Colvin because he was a great mentor and supporter of mine. And he ended up being an advisor to Tony Shepherd and to the board of Transfield Services, and particularly in terms of recruiting non-executive directors. And so I received a call one day from John Colvin after I had commenced my NED career. I was already on the board of NBN Co and Wesfarmers at the time, and he said that Transfield Services was going through some board refresh and they were particularly keen to have a woman on the board. And they were also keen to have some more exposure to Western Australia. And so he had thought of me as someone that might fit the bill and wanted to know whether I'd be prepared to have my name put forward. But he encouraged me in the strongest terms to put my name forward because he felt that the experience that I would have in Transfield Services would add something to me as a person and a non-executive director, and I have to say he was absolutely right in terms of encouraging me to do it. So I then obviously was interviewed by the board and had a number of interactions with Tony Shepherd, with Peter Good, who was the CEO at the time, and then subsequently joined the board.
Great, that's amazing. I'm just trying to remember back to the first indication that you were on the list as a potential director, and Tony mentioned it to me, and I remember looking at your CV at the time thinking that's a fantastic CV. That would be something that would add, as a person, a tremendous amount of capability to the board, and it was good to have, again, a female because we wanted to lift that count, and it's gone a lot further, and we can come to that chapter a bit later under your stewardship. But, I think your own background, particularly with strategic knowledge, was very, very important. And I remember, and very clearly, one of the great contributions you've made during my time as a director, as a colleague of yours at Transfield Services, was your capacity to actually ask those really tough questions, and that came through that huge history you'd had in strategic business planning. Yeah. So it was great, and here you are, and now you've finally got to the point as being a chairman of this wonderful company, and I remember when this opportunity came about for you to become the chairman, supported it as I could in my capacity. I wasn't on the board then, but it was really, for me, one of the wonderful things for the company and a great progressive development, I think,
No, and it's a role that I'm really enjoying. But it was very important to me that I did have broad-based acceptance, firstly to join the board, but then also, to become the chairman, because I think that respect that support shows is the thing that you build your chairmanship upon. It's the foundation on which you want to stand. This is probably something I'm sure I would have mentioned to you at some point, but we didn't talk about often, but that wasn't my first touch of Transfield. My first touch of Transfield was way back in the early 90s when I was working at Westpac, and I worked in Frank Conroy's office as his chief of staff. And there were myriad connections between Westpac and your family. And so I met your father at that time, and he had a great impression on me. So when I was approached about the directorship, and I saw that you and Luca were on the board, I was actually a little bit nervous, you know, because I had your father and your family on somewhat of a pedestal because of the achievement, and particularly because of the philanthropy and the contribution to the nation. You know, it was something that struck me, and I remember the courtesy and the intelligence of your father, and that had a great impact on me. To see someone who I felt was such an important person and had such a right to perhaps throw his weight around a bit, you know, because of the contribution he'd made. But it was a big learning for me to see just how courteous and humble, you know, he was, and how concerned he was about other people's comfort. And I was working in a big bank where there were a lot of big egos, and people that didn't deserve that, to have an ego as big as they did, you know, compared to your dad.
That's interesting, those comments, yeah. And in fact, that goes back to the time when we were bidding Collie Power Station, and Frank, well, the bank was actually backing us, Westpac was backing us, and Frank was a great human being. I had a lot of time for him. He was a really good guy. That's a whole other story.
Yeah. And Frank knew that part of the world really well, because his first managership was at Brookton.
Right,
you know, down in, and he, you know, good West Australian like me.
Yeah, I've forgotten that. That's amazing. Yeah. Anyway, so, you know, we got good support from Westpac during those years of Collie. We didn't end up building the power station at Muja area, but in the end, you know, we had a very successful run up until the point when the State Electricity Commission of West Australia decided to take another path and build it directly rather than through a build, own and operate. But notwithstanding, that whole chapter really gave us a lot of experience, and Westpac were really at the forefront, I think, of that, what I call it, the build, own and operate, the sort of infrastructure funding through banks as opposed to through governments, which is that was changing over through the 80s into the 90s. And I have to say Transfield Holdings led a lot of that with the work we did with Sydney Harbour Tunnel, Melbourne City Link, New Southern Railway, number of power stations. So we had all of that stuff. And we brought, of course, when we listed, well before your involvement with Transfield Services, when we listed the company in 2001, we actually seeded it with a number of our significant infrastructure investments that had been built up in Transfield Holdings. So we actually put them into Transfield Services, and it gave it sort of a shandy of operating and maintenance activities, as well as real infrastructure projects that were generating revenues, and mostly we were actually the operators on as well. And that gave us that gave the company a whole capacity to develop further operating and maintenance type contracts, because it wasn't right for the company to go and build more build, own and operate type of projects. That wasn't its remit, if you like. We then separately put forward the infrastructure fund, where we put all of those major assets into, and the company then kept going on the operations and maintenance area. But that was a very novel way of approaching it. I think this gave Transfield Services the lift that then made it so interesting and attractive, particularly in the early thousands, to be the dominant player in industrial maintenance.
It's a really interesting thing to look back on. I was recently in Canada participating in a joint Canada-Australia infrastructure and economic symposium, and so I needed to explain who Transfield Services is and what the history was and where it had come from. And I think that mission and vision is just as relevant today as it was when the company first listed, you know, almost sort of 15 years ago, I guess. And I think I've got quite a lot of energy still, and there's a lot of energy around the board table and with the executive to make that mission so central and really push forward against it and challenge and test ourselves, because I think we can be the premier company in this space again, and we haven't found any reason why that shouldn't continue to be the vision. So it's interesting to come to that view.
Yeah, it is, and I think this is a good time for a renaissance of the company. You know, it has been through some tough years. I mean, we did dominate up until 2007 the space completely, and we were very successful. I think our capital structure was poorly implemented, in fairness, and that was tested through the GFC, and we didn't come out so well out of that. And then I think we just probably became a little bit too aggressive in some of the acquisitions we pursued in those years. But those are all lessons for any company, and we're not the only one that has made those sort of things. And I talk as if I'm still involved, but of course we're not. But it just shows you the depth of sentiment and connection, really, because this was a company which was really seeded within Transfield Holdings back in the 90s, in the early 90s. 93 was the first time we actually purposefully bid for an operating and maintenance contract, and it was for Melbourne Water actually at the time, and it was to maintain their sewage and water system, about a third of Melbourne, pipes of less than 300 millimetres in diameter. And we won that contract, and I remember David Ibrecht, who I sort of keep stating as really the father of Transfield services in this sense, because he was the one who convinced me to get a Transfield construction letterhead, rub the construction off and put maintenance. Transfield Maintenance was the first time we actually used the name. We won the contract, and then, having been successful, bunched together some other activities we had in the company and created a whole new philosophy in the company. We actually had a new CEO run it, because we knew the philosophy between construction and operations and maintenance was completely different. And we had a lot of internal arguments and wrangles about that before we listed the company. But finally, when we did list it, we already had $700 million of turnover in this fledgling thing that had only been operating for 7 years. So, you know, this was just showing you how the whole area was developing. And full circle back to what you said just now, that, you know, there's an opportunity to really claim again the high ground. I think there is, but it is all about service ethics. It's all about making the customer feel special. It's all about giving them something different and making them feel like they're getting a value proposition. You know, and whichever company can do that, and there's no reason why Transfield Services can't. You know, there's got to be a winning formula.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, we've got customers now that are under a lot of stress. You know, there are huge challenges in all the sectors that we're working with, and I think when times are tough, if you can have the resilience to step forward and say, you know, actually we're going to take some bets at the moment, and we're going to really try to get inside the skin of our customers, work out what it is they want, I think we've got the opportunity to move forward. And it's certainly what we're doing with the government. You know, we're doing tough work for the government, you know, not just in the immigration contract, you know, but also in some of the work we do in defence and some of the work we're doing in public transport, because we're working as our clients are reshaping the way they operate. And so, you know, because we do a lot of the feeding and watering, you know, and as they say, an army marches on its stomach, there's so many of the things that we've got to get right to keep the hygiene operating so that the client's got a good foundation to make the change from. And I think it's a good example of the type of work that we can do.
Yeah, it is. But, you know, I think you've just touched on this very important element, and that is that, you know, we're a company that's toughened up. It's not toughening up, it's toughened up. It understands to the issues of providing the services to the customers in those difficult areas, because, you know, operations and maintenance sounds glamorous, but it's not. It's just bloody hard work. And then it's also hard work when it's combined with complex political back environments, and we've seen that particularly with Manus Island and Nauru. But, you know, I'm personally very proud of the fact that you guys are still doing that, because somebody has to do it, you know, and we're an Australian company, and the government's got a policy, and basically it's been backed by both sides of politics.
Exactly.
Get on with it, you know, and okay, there's going to be a few people who don't like it, but that's democracy. You're entitled to that, but you've got to get on and actually provide the services, because somebody's got to do it, and we can do it as well as better than anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I've been up to Manus Island and spent time there, you know, with our people, and walked through the compounds and interacted with the asylum seekers. And, you know, I think the company should be very proud of the way that people are operating, and not only that, but the capability building that we're doing on Manus Island. You know, so we have a very local workforce in a lot of areas there, and we're building real skills. We've got people, you know, in hospitality who are doing training in food service, food preparation, you know, so getting their certificates, building skills for themselves for the future. We've got a college there where we're helping them with their agricultural elements, and so they're starting to grow fresh vegetables for us to use in the mess on Manus. The day that I was there, the first 40 lettuces got harvested, and sort of 20 went into our kitchen and 20 went home with the students. And you see that sort of thing, and our people are contributing to the eradication of mosquitoes on Manus that will deal with malaria problems there. And in this very difficult politicised environment, they still have that human outreach to the people that they see around them that aren't as fortunate as them. It's something to be very proud of.
It is, and I think my own personal view on this is that this is a very difficult and twixt area to work in, under a policy that does have some criticism, and I know the government is trying to improve it, and they've looked at maybe what they've done in the past could have been done better, which has given rise to a lot of the complaints, I think, probably rightfully so on reflection. But I think with the selection of Transfield services to modify and change the way they actually deal with the people on the location, that's where the opportunity is to actually do this better under a difficult policy. But eventually, I think, if this policy succeeds, you'll do yourself out of a job eventually in time, and that's not a bad thing, because that capability will be redirected elsewhere and that learning. So, but that's another chapter. That's not for us to really get into today.
No,
but while we're talking about that fraught area, we should probably reflect on the exit of Transfield Holdings from the Biennale, which really was spurred on by activists taking a view that really the connection between, it's like an ethical investment sort of connection, that Transfield Holdings has got an investment in Transfield Services, and Transfield Services is doing the operations and maintenance on Manus and Island and Nauru. And that by definition means that somehow tainted money is going to support the arts. That's an unfortunate conclusion that these people came to, and actually didn't recognise properly the history of the Transfield Holdings investment or support of the Biennale, which had been going for 41 years. How did you see that, Di, as an observer and also a participant, because you're on the board in a sense, and had to actually deal with some of the issues internally?
Yeah, it was a very disappointing episode. As I said, one of my first interactions, so many years ago, was to recognise the philanthropy and the support of the arts that Transfield had provided, and I was very proud of that, and and all of the charitable events that we supported. So we, of course, have questions from our investors on a very regular basis about how we're managing our ESG obligations, how the board thinks about risk in those areas. And we have a very open dialogue, and it's very helpful. And the thing that I was most disappointed about was that we weren't able to have an open dialogue with the artists. There was some outreach to us saying, well, we want to meet with you. And there were certainly some people in Transfield Services that were feeling, well, this is a bad risk idea, Diane, you probably don't want to do that. But Luca and I talked about it, and we felt that we should be prepared to have a dialogue. If we weren't bold enough to sit down with people who had a different perspective to ours and explain our reasons and give them an opportunity to question us directly, then we wouldn't be fulfilling the sort of obligation we felt we had to the charitable effort. So of course we made the offer, yes, happy to meet, but for one reason and another, and definitely not of Luca and my doing, we never had that meeting. So I was driving home one day in Perth, and I got a call on my mobile phone from a girlfriend who said, turn on 720 ABC, there's some of the artists talking about this issue. So I pulled the car over, pulled out my notepad and started listening, and I didn't need to take any notes as it turned out, but it was a real eye-opener for me, because they were talking about what they thought was the motivation behind the sponsorship and support of the arts from corporates in general and Transfield specifically. They were basically saying that they felt they had strong positive brands in the community as artists, and we were trying to buy shelter for our corporate brands, which were tarnished by our activities by sponsoring them. And for me, it was completely a different thing. My view is that artists are a vibrant and important part of our community. They give us pleasure in the things they create. They challenge us with their ideas. But for multiple reasons, we don't value them in the way that we should, and that comes out in our valuation yardstick, which is money. And so many artists, without corporate support, other sorts of grants and so forth, just wouldn't be able to, you know, follow their artistic passion. So my idea of corporate sponsorship is about sort of filling that gap between what the market's prepared to pay and what an artist actually needs to be able to, you know, exist in our society. So I very much missed the opportunity to have that conversation directly with the artists. I think there was some really very solid support from the corporate community. I was very struck by Mark Carnegie stepping into the space and being very clear about the risks that the artistic community were taking if they didn't bring some sanity to the conversation. And so I think there was some damage to the relationship between corporate Australia and arts Australia, if you will. But I think that was mitigated quite a bit by the way that Transfield Holdings carried itself, Luca in particular, and by the way some of these other commentators stepped in. But it's not an episode that I think the artistic community should be too proud of.
No, I agree with you. You know, I think that I was just reflecting as you were talking about the reason my father actually participated in the arts at all. Well, firstly, he was an artist of you know, an amateur artist, but of quite good capability. And he'd learnt most of that during the war, by the way, when he was in a prisoner of war camp in India when the Brits caught him in North Africa. He was fighting with Rommel and the German forces. But anyway, I won't go into that chapter. That's a really interesting one, but not appropriate for today. But I think about the way he started his support of the arts. It was like a symbiotic relationship as much as anything else. He saw the need in the early 50s and 60s to actually bring cultural development to this country, and he could see that the combination of supporting artists who really didn't have much support base at all in those days, firstly through the Transfield Art Prize and then through the Biennale. So the Transfield Art Prize through the 60s and then the Biennale from 1973 onwards to what's still going now. You know, these were wonderful platforms where artists could actually show their works and get a platform to actually be able to demonstrate what they're doing. And Dad had always a view that there was a real link between artists and engineers. You know, both groups had ideas and both groups had to actually create life out of them. They had to do something with that idea and turn it into something. And so that's why he admired artists that actually could deliver their idea in a succinct way, in a way that people reacted to it. And that's what was one of his great pleasures, to see that, and then the connection to engineering, which was very much the same. So I think the philanthropic thing from my father didn't start so much because of, oh, I feel I must do something and give back. It was actually more about giving artists the platform and also associating the company and his own interest with it, because he felt, well, I have the same values as those people. Let's do this together. Let's get a symbiotic relationship. So I think that's how I feel as much about art today as anything else. So in my own activities, whether it's through as chairman of the Biennale back in the 90s, whether it's as the chairman of the Australian Chamber Orchestra or the president of the Art Gallery, I always feel that, you know, how can the knowledge that I've gained be useful for art? And how do I help our society get a much better cultural position internationally or locally as a result of that? So how do I add to it? And it's through my own personal engagement and also through our financial engagement. So that's how I see that sort of relationship coming. And the benefit to a company that's associated with me, that's sort of a secondary thought, and it's not actually the primary thought. So there's a very different way to approach philanthropy, actually, and I'm very proud of having come to that conclusion because I've learnt it through my father, who showed me that over decades, really. Yeah, it's very interesting.
And I think the legacy of the Biennale is much greater than just the opportunity to introduce the people of Sydney and the people that travel here to leading edge contemporary art. I think it's actually changed the way that people who are resident in Sydney and people who visit it interact with the city. Because when you think about the size of some of the installations that have been bought here, it drove you to needing to use unique, different, innovative, creative venues. So you've used the footprint of the city in a very different way, and I think particularly the venues out in the middle of the harbour, I don't think they'd be vivid in the way that it is now without the leadership of the Biennale. And so one of the things that was really concerning me when all of this came up was, how on earth are people going to get to see the art that's on the islands in the harbour? Because of course the only way to get there is water access, and Transfield Services in a JV operates the ferries, and so I was very concerned there was going to be a boycott of the ferries because of our involvement. But of course that didn't happen, and it was a very interesting thing for me to have to sit back and say, do we try to mitigate this? Do we mention this as a problem? Do we just keep mum about it and see what will happen? And so in the end we did nothing, and people used the ferries, and the artists didn't go to that particular place, which I think does say something about what their motivations really were.
Right. Exactly. Now, we just mentioned my father, and I think it's appropriate to also talk about this wonderful award that Transfield Services still has, which is the Guido Belgiorno-Nettis Award, the FBN Award, which is every year awarded to the division, if you like, that's got the best safety, performance, customer feedback, all of those sort of things. And it's been a great idea, initiated while Dad was still alive, actually, and it's still going. And you know, we're very happy to still be associated with it, even though we don't have a position as a...
No, it's a very important award, and last year we revitalised the whole idea of the award and how it would be delivered. So it's the pinnacle of all of the awards that we provide, but we have added in a specific Chairman's Safety Award to just recognise a particular safety initiative, and we've instituted the Tony Shepherd Contract Manager of the Year to recognise that the contract managers are the heart and soul of the company. And we've added an award for each of the companies for values, and so it gives people an opportunity to nominate their co-workers for this suite of awards, and then we bring together the extended leadership team of the company, so the top 80 people and all of the nominees, and have a big awards night where we really reinforce what the company is about, reinforce the history of the company, and set the FBN award sort of in the context of all of those other things. So you can see some people contribute here, but the person who contributes in a very holistic way and embodies the spirit of the, founder of the company is the one who receives this pinnacle award. So it was fantastic to be there last year, and I'm very much looking forward to this year's event.
Well, then either Lupa and I will be there again this year. So
I think you might have been sailing or something.
I was
actually.
I was competing.
That's right. Yeah, so we weren't able to have you. So we're very much looking forward to you being.
Yeah, that'd be good.
This year.
I look forward to doing it. Yeah, but it is a good award, and it's a good way to celebrate the achievements of the company internally. Because often companies do congratulate teams for their work, but this is a very visible one for the whole company, and so the whole company can actually think about how do they lift their game, and that internal competition I think is very useful. I've found when it's done in the right way, and I think certainly under this sort of series of awards, it's really very beneficial. So we mentioned Tony Shepherd just now because there's an award named after his leadership, and I think it's important to recognise Tony's leadership. He firstly was with us. He was an executive at Transfield Holdings when Transfield Services was listed in 2001. He worked in the division that I was running at that time called Project Development. And I think the genius that Tony brought to us was actually how to package up the business which included the, as I mentioned earlier, the putting together of the infrastructure assets. So we had Dean Wills as our initial chairman, and then Tony took over from Dean in 2006, I think it was, or 7. And Tony, really did preside through a period of good and bad. When I say bad, difficult times at Transfield Services, and I think he probably feels that the contribution he made may not have been properly reflected. But I think Tony actually was a key to what Transfield Services was actually able to create, if you like, in the marketplace. I think the company went through economic times that were difficult through the GFC and other things. But when I think of some of the initiatives that Tony brought to it and his steady hand with some of the very difficult matters that we had to work through, I've always found it a very impressive leadership that he brought, and then of course he passed on to you. So what are your thoughts of Tony or your memories of him?
Well, I think anyone who thinks that Tony didn't have an incredibly successful tenure, at Transfield, in whichever part of the company he was in, is sort of a bit lacking in nuance and the long view. Because I think we all know there are cyclical ups and downs, and measuring at a point in time is not a very smart thing to do. But the thing that Tony has done for me, as a chairman following him and a first-time chairman of a listed entity, is to set a very high bar for the way you think about stewarding the company and understanding what the company does. So the first thing that he said to me when I joined the board was, okay, you're not an engineer, you're not someone that's got deep infrastructure expertise. We put you on the board for other things, but you better backfill some of that stuff fast. And so he really encouraged me to get out onto site to understand what it was the company did on a real day-to-day basis. And then he would interrogate me after I had done these visits. A couple of them we did together, because he wanted to see what was I learning, what was I really taking away. And the day that I think I got the tick was when I said to him my observations of watching some shutdown and turnaround work that we were doing and the very bespoke nature of it, and how the facility might have been designed at day dot with the thought that yes, it would be easy to maintain, but work that had happened subsequently, enhancement changes, new technologies, had meant it was a very difficult plant to actually maintain, and that's more the norm. And so we had a group of people there, guys on the tools, the safety supervisors, the foreman of the crew, the engineering experts, the company men, and they were trying to work out how to do some very difficult maintenance, and the problem solving and the technical excellence of all of that, but the care for each other and the safety. That was what encapsulated Transfield services. And I went back to Tony and described that and said, I think I get it now.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And he said, yeah, you do, you get it.
Yeah.
So Tony was very generous with me in terms of making me the best director that I could possibly be. I think he had in the back of his mind that I might make a chairman candidate, but probably a little bit down the track. So he was very clearly, keeping an eye on the succession plan and, how that would occur. And then, as happens, some changes occurred in other people's personal circumstances, opportunities that came available to them. And so I think, my development on the board became perhaps a bit more accelerated.
Yeah.
And then Tony certainly did put a lot of care into making sure that I was ready to make the transition, but also ensuring that I went through a very solid process. So it wasn't just, a chairman's pick of the next chairman, that the board actually did that. And I thought the way he conducted the process was just another hallmark of what a solid person he is, and the integrity of the guy.
Great. So, Di, then really looking back and sort of the engagement of Transfield Holdings through Luca and myself as firstly as board directors, and then following on from that, what are any of the memories you might have of that interaction? Because this, what we're trying to summarise here is how Transfield Holdings has effectively participated in its investments, and whether it did it well or not so well. And this is awards and all. So I'm happy to hear where you think we could have done things better, or and how we can learn, because life is about learning. And if we can take away some chapters where we maybe didn't get it right, I'd be interested in hearing that as well.
It's a very interesting question, because as you would know, when you're considering joining a board, you're looking to do your due diligence, and the single most important thing is who you're going to be sitting around the table with. And so what you do is you cast around through your network to find people that know the people that are sitting on the board and experiences they've had. And in this circumstance, with Transfield Services, you look at the board and there's two of the founders' family members, two sons sitting on the board, and there is a bit of chatter going on in the investing community that the percentage holding is not enough to have two directors from that family on the board. So you see that immediately. It's out in the public domain, and it's a very interesting debate that's happening. So for me, that was quite interesting. I wanted to understand that. And I think I remember saying this both to yourself and to Luca, I'm not a particularly rules-based person. And so my view was, well, are these people good directors? So that was the question I was asking of people around the board table. I was asking of Tony, I was asking John Colvin, the advisor. And the answer I was getting back was they're actually very good directors. They've got all of the skills and wisdom that you would want in that role, and they've both got deep exposure to the company, and they're both formally qualified in ways that are very useful to the company. They've both worked in the company. They're very different. They bring different perspectives. They're not a voting bloc. It's not like that at all. So that gave me comfort, to come onto the board. And then as I said to the both of you, I'm not rules based. I'm not going to say it's not enough of a ownership stake to have two directors, because once I'd worked with you, you go, you've got someone that's formally qualified, they're a member of the founding family, they've worked directly in the business, they're a fantastic director. This is great. Oh look, there are two of them, even better. And so that was how I approached it. And I knew there was going to have to be a change. And I wasn't looking forward to that day, and I don't think anyone on the board was, because, the governance police, I think, do like a one-size-fits-all, and it just wasn't appropriate for us. But I thought the eventual solution, when you and Luca left the board, was elegant. It wasn't a long standing solution. It didn't last for a long time, but it was a good solution, and it interestingly delivered us a very interesting director in Roy McKelvey, who has continued on the board and certainly brings a very important flavour to our deliberations. And of course we would never have found Roy if it wasn't for
That's right.
the association that he had with you. And we went through the same process, of course, with Roy, which was, first off, is he a good director? Can he bring diversity? Will he stand his post? Well, of course, Roy stands his post. But I've certainly enjoyed the development of all of the directors around the table, but in some ways, particularly Roy, because even though the sort of holdings connection is tenuous, given the short tenure he had in the role as CEO, there is still that understanding of the business that you had. Yes, you're changing it now, but of the two of you as individuals. And so I like that connection through Roy, and I love the fact that he's developed into such a strong director.
Yeah, oh, that's good. I'm glad that.
But I learnt a great deal from you and Luca on lots of different levels. I think because you are so different and you react to things in different ways. And I remember when Luca and I were, talking about branding a lot, and the COG was coming up, and did we want to move in that direction, and how did we think about the tea and the colours and so forth. And Luca, of course, has, such a deep understanding of those types of areas and a very strong, sort of innate instinctive reaction to them. He's a very stylish guy. And so I really enjoyed that. And I learnt from you a lot about how to ask questions about the sort of technical elements without necessarily feeling that I had to understand the answer before I got there. So it's interesting how you learn something from everyone along the way. And I also learnt from you that if something is giving you a bit of a knot in your stomach, you don't leave it sit there. You've got to have the courage of bringing it out. And I like the fact that both of you allowed me to be, perhaps a bit vulnerable as an early director on the board, in that if I didn't really know something, you were both very happy to, give me some coaching, on the side, give me the background, how you would think about it, but more importantly, to allow that process also to come out in the boardroom, but in a supportive way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's some really good observations, and I'm, sort of flattered and honoured that you took that view of both of us. And, on the point about Luca and I, as a voting bloc, we were never a voting bloc.
No.
There's plenty of decisions we didn't agree on.
That's
so
right.
We're very independent people.
Yeah.
But, I hope that we did make a contribution during those years, and also to your own time, because you did come in without a deep knowledge in the areas in which we would. So, for me personally, I love the idea of sharing that knowledge and helping somebody understand it better, because it makes it more effective, and ultimately, it's, as my dad would always say, it's the results that count. It's the only thing that counts, the results. So, getting there. So thank you for those words there, Di. We did mention, you did mention on the way through the issue about branding, so it's probably appropriate we talk about that. It might be a point to finish up this discussion on, which was, the time has come for Transfield Holdings to reclaim its brand. It does have a very strong love of the tea, and now that we're not deeply involved in Transfield Holdings anymore, we felt that it was probably better that, rather than let a company drift away from us in terms of its direct relationship, using the brand that my dad actually founded in 1956, we thought we should bring it back. So it's with some sadness that we actually asked the company to, or advised the company to, rebrand, and I think it'll be Transfield Services, probably through yourself, and Graham will be announcing that at the AGM this year.
That's right. Yeah.
But
we'll be asking the shareholders for their approval.
With their approval. So, but technically, we'll get it back early next year, and that does complete another chapter. But life is about start and stop and reforming and whatever. So, I'm very confident that Transfield Services, in whatever name it's going to be called, is going to be successful under your leadership and Graham's. And so I just would have liked to make that point, that this probably formally, ceases or formally stops the relationship that we've had for a long time. But I can tell you, I'll still feel very passionate about the company, because ultimately the DNA is in there, because we did create it in the 90s, and we had more than 20 years of activity through it. So it's a long time.
No, that's exactly right. And it is a wrench to change the name and to give the logo back. But it's also, I think, very much a part of the evolution and the change of the company. And in talking to staff about it, it's given us an opportunity to engage with our people and soon with our customers to have the conversation about what the new brand will be. We've had a lot of input from staff. And the thing I liked the most about it was we were challenging, what is it that the company stands for, and how important, is the brand, and what are the things that we need to do as we're thinking about changing it, because we don't have an option to not change, because, the licence is going to come to a natural termination. And people were very clear that the company stands for the same thing that it stands for when it was formed. It is all around the service of customers, and if we stop, they stop, and being very integral to their mission and standing inside their shoes. And so that mission would never change, and so it's brand independent. And so I think people saw, given the point we are in the cycle and the challenge a lot of our customers are having, that this gives us an opportunity to speak to our customers about what's important to them. So the big message from staff was, we're sad we're going to miss it. We understand we have to do it, but please don't you lot in leadership mess up this opportunity to have a very solid and meaningful interaction with the customer.
Yeah.
So we will reveal where we're heading. It's going to be very different. I think it absolutely respects the legacy of where we've come from, and we're going to build that bridge and make it very clear to people. So I'm very excited to get to that next step.
Well, good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you for participating in today's discussion.
No, it's
Really
been an
enjoyed
absolute
it.
pleasure.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
you.